Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone around the world. I'm Paul Sisler, and this is In the Moment. And here is T-Paw with the Vellum. Do you like the new opening?
Yeah, like I don't know if you saw, but I was doing jazz hands. I was like,
All right. And how are you doing today?
um, woke up with a giant panic attack, but I'm here and I'm fine.
All right, all right. So we have the topic today of what makes a story a story.
Yep, I wanted to cover that because, as everyone who's likely been watching us knows, I've been working on finishing a novel, and I've already got a second one written. Did that on purpose. I was, writing them back to back. And I'm going to be working on the next three or next two, three, something like that. Either way. And so I wanted to cover like what makes a story, like building conflict and character and its relation to world building. We've been talking about world building. We've been talking about the hero's tale for quite a few weeks now, and I kind of wanted to go into like how it all co-relates. How it like we're not wrapping up the whole hero's tale discussion at all. But I wanted to do like a checkpoint basis where like you're like working on your own thing, like you're getting your book ready and you're working hard on that, and so anyone out there who's like struggling with writing, because I've seen that a lot on Twitter, like as I'm like going through my feed, I'm seeing people like run into roadblocks or run into areas like they're trying their hardest to get a story written. And so what makes a story a story? Like, is it character? Is it world building? Is it throwing magic spells at each other? Is it character dies and then comes back as Gandalf the White? Like what really builds a story? And for me personally, I think it comes down to character. It comes down to who is this person? How do they exist in their world? And then in doing so, how does their world exist with them? Like how does the world tie into everything? Because like you could create elves, you can create orcs and dwarves and have like these like nice high fantasy scenes, or you could do like cyborgs and shit. But like uh, in all reality, it comes down to who are the characters? What is the heart? What is their motivation? Uh, One of the things I like to focus on when I write my own tales is is this a story of inheritance? Is this a story of power? Is this a story of love? Is the person having to sacrifice their own passions to keep their family alive? Is the character having to, give up part of themselves for the greater good? And on the flip side, if it's a villain, since the villain is ready to sacrifice the world for you, then would the villain uh, basically have to give up their own power to save the people they love? Since they're considered a villain character, they would be like, "Oh, that's a hero." It's like, oh, is it really though? Like, what if the hero or the villain is a complex character that's barely constitutes as a villain? So I wanted to kind of go into that. Can you guys tell me what the theme of the story is? That's a good question, Cornelia. Yeah, so the theme of a story is basically a thematic summarization of what your story is supposed to be. Like with Peter Parker, it's great power comes great responsibility. With Punisher, it's what is the difference between justice and punishment? Where do you draw the line? And what lesson are you passing? Like, are you trying to teach these drug dealers not to be drug dealers anymore, or are you just pursuing a career of vengeance? And it comes down to thematically, how does a story come together with the heart? And so that's where what we're talking about today is theme. Part of it is theme, part of it is character, part of it is the story. And if like your warlords are all fighting over power, well, what are they searching for power for? Like, is it for their loved ones? Is it because they're just greedy? Like, is it because they just want to be able to touch gold or whatever the currency is? Like, what is their purpose? What is the operis mirandi, if you will, the OM? Like, what is that it functions with a character? And that's, one of the things that really struck me when I was working on this current story, because for me, I don't think of I don't think black, white, I don't think brown, I don't think any of that. I think character. And that's part of why, like, for instance, Sam, which is going to be one of my next books, Sam's character, she's mixed race. And, but yet she, like, I'm operating like she's a human being, even though she's a part Fae. And so what I'm doing is I'm taking that character and I'm going, well, what makes her herself? Like, she's got two different sides of her family that are dealing with mental illness, and she gets undercut by other characters because of her race. So, is this a race story? Is it a racial story? No. It's a story about the human condition. And so, when you break down what makes a story, you come down to the elements of character and how that relates to the heart of the story. Paul, what are some of your thoughts on that? Because I don't want to keep going on too long.
Oh, how do characters address the theme of a story? Okay. All right. Well, let's go back up to, you were talking about building conflict in characters and its relation to world building. I think the character kind of, again, it depends upon what you write, because I mean, let's go back to like Walt Disney with Fantasia, where there's no talking. Okay, it's all music, and there's still a story there. You know what's going on, and the story's been being told with how the characters move and what happens. Okay, um, so do you need words? Well, when you're writing, obviously you need words because you're gonna tell exactly what it is. But when you're doing that illustration of trying to present, you want something that's going to keep somebody enthralled within it. That they're, and that's where like conflict comes in. There has to be something in there that is a driving force. Uh, what is the motivation behind it? What is it that is it a good versus evil type thing? Is it a seeking out a relationship type thing? So a love interest, whatever the case may be. In relation to theme with what Cornelia was asking, um, that can vary, is the theme of the story love? Does it fall into the tropes of like the hero's tale, or or is it magic? Is it something like mine? I guess my theme to like the stories that I'm doing are political. Okay, because I involve a lot of politics. I'm putting messages out there about a lot of different things. So, in relation to the characters, I have people that are illustrating the politics of my story. So, those characters are built upon that aspect of it. So, I guess where, because that would be the character motive, right? And then how do characters address the theme of a story? I would say that my characters are what highlight the theme. My characters is what brings that theme to life, and through their actions, you recognize what that theme is.
You know
Uh,
what? Another thing I want to add to that, when your characters are addressing the theme of the story, what are they doing? What are the actions they're taking? And they don't know that they're in a story unless you're breaking the fourth wall. They don't know that, that you have a theme going on. So how do you address the theme with the characters? What are they doing? What are they doing as characters? What is the question of the story? Is it boy gets told he has inheritance, and he is told that he might or might not come from a form of evil. So then, is the story love versus power? Is it inheritance versus legacy? Which is essentially the same thing, but it's different. There's like a defining line there. And so when it comes to how characters address the theme of the story, what are they doing? What actions are they taking? And how do they address, their own like motivation? Like in Snake of the Dame, it comes down to inheritance and legacy versus love. It comes down to, how does Peter handle the legacies being handled, and does it conflict with protecting those that he cares about? And also, if he's being tracked down by this demon character who wants power and love, do they conflict, or are they essentially the same, like a mirrored image? So when you're addressing the theme of the story with the characters, you're basically having a theme that helps summarize your whole story from beginning of the story when the opening credits happen to the closing when the credits roll. And hopefully your landing, like your delivery, your execution of that will play in your reader's head or viewer's head till long after the credits roll. Like that person who read it will be thinking about that until, like, they'll never forget it, likely, because you've executed it so well. And so when the characters are addressing a theme, they are acting in the story, and they're hopefully not being passive about it.
Well, see, I kind of look at it a little bit differently. I mean, what you said is absolutely true, but it's like I don't have just like one theme to my story. I have multiple themes. Okay. As in, even though politics is like the main theme that you catch, there's also an underlying theme of harmony, because the objective of the story is to reach that harmony.
So is it chaos v harmony?
What's that?
Is it chaos v harmony? Chaos versus harmony? Like absolute chaos of power versus peace and harmony that they're trying to, get towards?
Yes. That would
That's
be
your theme.
right.
That's your theme.
For the most part, yes. But there's other key aspects, because the characters is what builds the politics aspect of it. Okay? It's their actions that bring the harmony. So the story itself is being developed through the personalities of the characters and the politics that they must, go through. And then the underlying theme of harmony is through their actions and the choices that they make. So the politics and the characters' personalities and the actions thereof present that end conclusion of harmony.
So are the politics actually a character?
Authority is how I think of it. Yes, exactly.
That's exactly what I was talking about, Cornelia. As I was saying that the chaos is the body, chaos is the politics. Politics is a character. Like, for instance, in Game of Thrones, Song of Ice and Fire, the books themselves, the only two cast members that exist in the entire cast, which sounds weird because there's like 80,000 of them, but the two characters, the main two, are the living and the dead. And so when you are talking about theme and you're talking about execution, you're talking about the beginning and the end, chaos is your origin, it's your baseline. It's where your story starts. It's the politics. It's the sixth cast member or ex-cast member of the crew. Harmony is where you're trying to get to.
Oh, and it's
you're very welcome, Cornelia.
Cornelia. We got some catching up to do, sister. Please give me a call.
Right.
Yes. But no, now what pathways and what roadways do you use to accomplish this?
I basically outline everything. I outline what the theme is of the story, and often I'll revisit the theme too while I'm writing the story, because the theme has to be solid, because there has to be a question that's being asked and the question's being answered, a main one. And then by the time you get to the end of each chapter, you have many questions that are being answered. And then hopefully more questions are stirred up. So basically you outline the theme, the plotting of it, and then you also outline how many characters are involved. That way you don't overwhelm the reader, hopefully, or yourself. And you basically outline all the roadways and pathways that your characters are taking to get to the resolution. And that way you have a beginning, middle, and end. And you kind of I give myself some flexible room, which is why I'm a pantser and a plotter. Like, I'll come up with an overall plot, and then I'll pants my way around it by going with the vibe of what the character is following. And oftentimes it's hard to explain to people that are not in my head. But basically the gist of it is I outline everything that I can, while giving myself some wiggle room. Because if you don't give yourself wiggle room, you'll write yourself into a wall. At least I did. So
Yeah. See, I kind of do things differently. I have like my thoughts are like the opening and what is my main character and what is their job. And I have the conclusion of the story already in my head of what's going to happen. So I've already got the beginning and the end. So for me, it's a matter of then drawing up the outline of how I'm going to go from beginning to end and how do I fill that gap and what growth is my character going to have and what is going to be that character's blockades.
okay, makes sense. Yeah, you know, one of the characters that's actually in my story that it doesn't have a name, but it is a character. Chaos. It literally is. It's a character because you've got different characters that are warring for power in the background. You've got our teenagers who are essentially much like a Greek or Olympian demigod being given a task that they have to do. You have the adults who are also doing the task, which is Hunter is hunting down dark demons or evil demons to try to create a better place for his world to save his family. And then you've got Lionel, who's serving on the court, and he's essentially trying to do two things at once. He's trying to be a hand of the king, and he's trying to be a teacher. And the third thing he's trying to do is be a father. And it's hard to do all that. And you got all these different characters who are adults and characters who are teenagers who are all trying to do their one thing. But the thing that lives underneath all of that is chaos. And basically, peace is what's being trying to be struck. But when you've got multiple characters who are doing similar things, but for different motivations, you have a multi-layered story. But chaos is a character in my story. It's also a horseman. Horseman of the apocalypse. Chaos is one of the horsemen, which that plays into the threads of the story because when Peter and those guys run into Chaos the Horseman, which is one of the horsemen of the apocalypse, at least in my story, you start to realize that he's been stirring things since the beginning. Like he's been stirring everything for eons, and he's been watching as humans have been fighting each other and basically all of creation, whether you're a werewolf, a vampire, whatever you are. He's been stirring that up. And so anytime anything happens that it's bad or considered bad or negative, like arguments between family members, arguments between loved ones, clashing of power and stuff, the horsemen are not what you would consider a entity like us, where like they're living their lives and trying to do their jobs. The horsemen literally are like gods of themselves. And they all work with a single embodying individual, like a single source of power, but the chaos himself, he is chaos, and or they are chaos, and so therefore they are stirring things. It's kind of like Ares, the god of war, where Ares in the Greek mythologies was constantly stoking war to try to get people to fight each other and feed off of it. Chaos is similar.
Right. Right now, in your story, when you're building your story, when you're making your story, what line do you go to create your conflict? I mean, what is the aspect of conflict creation for your story? What do you usually do?
I ask a question. I say, what would happen if I take two family members who are having a disagreement, whether that's a fairy and a vampire, whether that's somebody else and somebody else. I go down to the bare basics of family or friends or whatever, loved ones, non-loved ones, hated ones, because that's what enemies essentially are. And I go, what happens when you take a grandmother who's dealing with trauma and you take a granddaughter who's dealing with her own trauma and you stick them into a blender and throw a bunch of special effects around it. And what happens when one of them's trying to find love, but they're too consumed by their own chaos to have love. And can they find that love? Can they remember what it's like to love? And basically, it's asking questions. It's asking questions and letting your characters help answer them.
Okay. Cornelia asks, internal conflict or external conflict? For me, I'm actually going to answer both of those for you right here. For me, it comes down to morals and beliefs. Um, that's all of my conflict is based upon morals and beliefs. You have a belief system in conflict with a belief system. And then the inner conflict, the internal conflict, is a belief system. I believe I am this and am not accepting that I am this. Or I believe in this and I cannot accept that. So all of my conflict comes down to the moral belief systems of an individual or a society or a community or a group.
Yeah, so internal conflict is essentially the gist of what happens when a person is dealing with a very escalated scenario and they are having an internal battle, like an internal conflict of some kind, whether it's a crisis of faith, whether it's a moral dilemma, whether it's, uh, a thing that stems, and they could even be an externally motivated character where the external conflict is internalized and therefore it becomes both. It's an external conflict of what happens when my community and my family is super religious and I am not. That's an internal conflict because then you start to internalize some kind of guilt or some kind of dogmatic structure of moral belief, and you start to wonder whether or not you're doing the right thing in the first place, especially if your external surrounding environment is creating a moral dilemma because it's nature versus nurture. Your nature says that you are this, and your nurture is trying to go against that and either trying to help you or destroy you.
Yeah.
So kind of both for me. Like I bounce and bound. It depends on the character really, and that's part of why I said that character is the heart of the story. If you don't have your character down, then you don't have your story down. Simple as that. Because how are you supposed to write a really awesome scene that's like climatic with a villain if your character's not down pat? Like how does the Doctor and Doctor Who work if he runs into scenarios or characters or enemies and he doesn't even know who he is? Like
Right.
then you've got a moral dilemma or you've got a crisis of faith, but you could play with that and say, oh well, he's trying to figure out who he is. Well, by the time you get to the end of the first chapter, he's got to have some kind of, and when I say first chapter, I don't mean like 10 pages. I mean in like, let's say your first book or let's say your first season or something. By the end of that runtime, there has to be some sort of discovery, like self-discovery. Because
Right.
otherwise you're going, okay, well, what's stage two? Like Mandalorian, for instance, season three, they're running into the dilemma that they waited almost like 6, 7 episodes to finally introduce what is considered their main villain. And yet the real main villain who's going to be used in another show is going to be missing in action for the entire season or for however long in the season. And so a lot of us that are watching The Mandalorian are watching season three and going, what the hell is going on? Where are we? Like, we knew that we knew you were taking Grogu to some place and we knew you were going from point A to point B, but now that ended like last season. The credits roll on that one in the second season. And you had a nice cameo, and then you had Book of Boba Fett, and then they kind of took a detour. So season three kind of feels like a giant MacGuffin chase, and like they're and like it's more about Bo-Katan than it is Mando, Din Djarin himself. And Din's story technically wrapped up when he bathed in the waters because he got to bathe in the waters and become a Mandalorian again. So it's like, well, what is he doing now as a character? We don't know. He just knows he's kind of there. And so, that is that crux right there, like the crux of character of like, who is he now? Like, what is he? Like, is he just a supporting character now? Like, is Bo-Katan the main character now? Like, that's where you run into that conflict of like, as a storyteller, is you're like, well, if I don't have my character down pat, then we're kind of just wandering around and just doing missions.
Yeah.
Hope that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Oh, yes, definitely. Definitely.
Figured to use a pop culture reference this time.
See, every conflict situation I have, whether internal or external, leads to another conflict. So as you get out of one, you're right into another.
Yep.
And I like to deal again. My underlining tone is politics, and because you have different belief systems when it comes to politics. Whether it's like I'll take the most common one that we're hearing a lot about today: pro-life versus pro-choice. You know, I make that part of, not in my books, but as the conflict is, both sides believe they are morally correct.
Yes, exactly, which is also a moral dilemma. And it's
Right.
also a spiritual dilemma too, because those
Yes.
people who are pro-life, claim to be spiritual. At least that's the idea, is that, if they're pro-life, then obviously they're spiritual or something. Whereas pro-choice is about the individual. It's about the individual's rights to choose.
Right. So these are the types of things, and again, not that I utilize that topic, but this is where my conflict always comes in the story, is that depending upon what even you as the reader, what your belief system is, you have to pick a side while you're reading. Is this morally right by my own standards, or is it morally wrong, but it's what I wish it was? As in, like with TJ, just destroying people that are evil, or at least what I portray as evil. And then TJ himself could be portrayed as evil. So your own definitions, not only is the conflict within the story, but you're going to find that conflict within yourself while you're reading. Is this just and right by my own belief system?
Exactly. And that's one of the things that I'm working on with my own stuff. I guess everybody is in their own way. Is that, when you got the moral dilemma and you have like the existential crisis, it starts to get blurred as to who's the villain and who's the hero. That's what makes great storytellers. Yes, indeed, Cornelia. And you're
Thank you.
definitely one of them.
Yes.
Like, that's one of the things I like most about fiction and dark fantasy, especially, is that you start to blur the lines of what's good and evil. And when suddenly good and evil really don't make sense, like they're not really, the good and evil are kind of like a stereotypical baseline. They're like, here's the compass, but like the compass doesn't always point north. It kind of goes west and east a little bit. Then suddenly you've got a bit more layered, because we ourselves are layered, and we ourselves always kind of have our compass hopefully point north, but sometimes it veers. And so, or, it wanders a little bit. And so that's one of the things I like most about painting a villain character is, are they truly a villain, or did we just make them one? Like,
Right.
they're often the most relatable characters.
Right. Well, again, that's another conflict aspect that I utilize in my story, because because we brought up spirituality, is that I have my characters in this first book who you're primarily associating with the vampires to begin with. And the vampires have been around for millennia. And they talk about how they've seen religions come and go, how they've seen empires come and go. And they talk about how, like, during the time of Jesus, Jesus wasn't there. There was no Jesus. So they know that all religions are falsehoods. Well, that's going to piss some people off when they read that. But
Mm-hmm.
this is the theological belief of my vampires, that there are no gods. And yet, as part of the story, we have somebody that is of the elemental energy of a creator that
Yep.
walked the face of the earth. So here it is before them, basically a God in the flesh. So again, it's like, whoa, wait, what a minute. What are you doing here, Paul? What are you doing? None of these other gods have existed, and yet you just created a God. Oh, this is the first time there's ever been a God? Well, yes, in this story there is. So now you take it for what it is, and it's just like, well, my conflict is now, well, I don't like these guys, and I like these guys because they have a God. And then when you realize that the people that are supposed to be the good guys weren't always that good of good guys, and the bad guys weren't always that bad of bad guys. And again, it's just like, so who's good and who's evil here? Again, you become in conflict with the story itself.
Yes, indeed. And that's, for me, it's like, that's why I think that with with storytelling, sometimes you can paint those lines by having them do very extreme things, like whether it's extreme good or extreme bad. And that way, like, there is a definite defined line. It's just blurred, but you have a defined line as to what makes them good or what makes them evil. And you can have a very cruel character doing really, nurturing things, or you can have not so cruel character who's more compassionate do very very cruel things, very despicable things because they believe they're doing the right thing. They believe they're on this noble conquest, and yet it's the opposite of what the reader would interpret. But yet it's a very real human condition thing.
Right. Now, I don't mean to be critical of you in your writing, but your
Mhm.
handwriting. So, where you have spirituality written, I can't read that sentence. I don't know what it says. What does it say after spirituality?
I told you I'm a terrible handwriter. That's why I type. But I've got big source of world building. It can make the story really sing.
Yes, spirituality. And let me profess there's a difference between spirituality and religion slash religious ideology. Okay. You can have a very, very spiritual story and not even talk about any gods or anything like that. It's about that essence and it's about that make you feel good aspect. So just because we're talking about spirituality does not mean we're talking about religions. Now, you can have religion in there, you can have it as part of the storyline, and it can make for a beautiful story, but it's all in how you present it and how you utilize it. And with me, I really slam organized religion in my stories. I mean, that's the personal aspect of me that I bring to it. I slam personal religions for a reason. But I bring a lot of spirituality because my spirituality, I'm a spiritual atheist. And I know a lot of people are like, Paul, that's an oxymoron. No, it is not. No, it is not. An atheist does not believe in a single creator of all things, whereas someone that is spiritual believes that there is a little more out there than what we know about. And I believe that little more that's out there that we know about, I believe that love plays a huge part of that. So I bring a lot of love and kindness into my stories in that spiritual aspect where I slam the bad aspects of religion, organized
Yeah, no,
religion.
yeah, no, and then that's a fair point too, because like there are those of us who are like for me, I've been I keep saying the sentence for me, but then you do it, and then I end up doing it anyway. So um, crisis of faith is something I've been dealing with for at least 4 years now. A little bit beyond that, but it was really started when my mom passed away. But that's part of why I decided to go into gods and monsters in my stories. Like I decided to go into like Lovecraftian lore, decided to go like into multiple god lore type thing. Like there's literally going to be the spaghetti monster, and that's going to be a character, like a spin on that. And there's also a god that is a a god that knows a lot of things, and they're literally a talking book that with legs. And that's for the next book. But we're going to be exploring different deities, different myth lore, different things. And it's that lens to that whole spirituality concept you're talking about, where, there would be people in this world who don't believe that those things exist because they just aren't running into them. You know, we're right now, we're in that space of a prince who happens to be a vampire, who happens to be, descended from mythical standards. What happens when you run into somebody who goes to the gas station to work or goes to another place to work in the world, and he doesn't run into that any day? In fact, if anything, when he looks online, he doesn't see any of that. He just sees, you know, debates and talks and stuff. And let's say, Peter runs into him at some point, and he like has never run into a single god in his life. He's never run into a single ghost. He lives a very ordinary life, And then suddenly Peter and those guys run into him and they need him to help them with something. And suddenly he becomes a core character, or they become a core character. And suddenly they're having a crisis of faith because they're like, I've never dealt with any of this before. Like, this is all brand new to me. Like, what do you mean there's a spaghetti monster for real? What do you mean there's a talking squid that's named Cthulhu or that's named something else? What do you mean that, does that mean that we're actually like, there's a meaning of life, or is this just a constant chaos nexus where a lot of like different mythical deities are trying to tell you guys how to live? Like, aren't they kind of douchebags then? Or are they kind of dicks? And then the Peter goes, yeah, they can be kind of dicks sometimes. And then in like something like that, like, you have characters who have never run into any of that because they just haven't, because the world's much bigger than just, our main cast. And our main cast is just what I'm focusing on at the moment. And you find out the world's much bigger, and you find out in the Eastern realms, maybe there's characters or elves or something that they have their own structure. And then the stuff that's on the Western side is mere rumor because they don't run into that every day. And so you've got that whole concept going on there when it comes to spirituality. And that's part of why I said that, like, big source of world building is spirituality. It's there are right now they're running into characters, like they're basically telling stories of characters on Mandalorian that Jedi are a myth. Jedi are a talked about thing that used to be a thing. And so when the dark saber is pulled out, it's considered a big, big thing because they're like, what the heck is this lightsaber, this sword that turns on and energy comes out of it? Like, what is that? And like, if you were to watch episode 1, 2, or 3, the Jedi would speculate what a dark saber is. They would not really know unless they looked in their archives, but they wouldn't know what it is. And so when Mando turns it on, the Din turns on the dark saber, and he turns it on, and the lightsaber goes all the way down, and he's trying to hold it and stuff, and it's a giant sword. And he's just like really blocky movements as he's trying to move it, but he doesn't know what it is, and he's just like, I don't know what this is. I'm going to take it back to its kind. And that's just how he puts it. He's like, he like looks at, at the child, as he calls Grogu, and he goes, I will take you back to your kind, where you can learn how to mingle with the rest of your kind. And it's like, so Din isn't even looking at Grogu as, just this baby alien. He's looking at him like it's this organism that he's trying to keep safe because he was paid to do so. But he says you're kind because he doesn't understand the kind yet. He only knows the Mandalorian way. And so you've got that whole spirituality crisis of faith there. And so I bring in that as an example to what you're talking about.
Right. No, I get it. Yes. Okay. So when we talk about spirituality being, a huge part of world building, you also talk about how the character is the heart of every story. Now, I want to let everyone know that character may not actually mean an individual because, as I brought up earlier in the show, let's go back to Walt Disney's Fantasia. It has all the Walt Disney characters, but none of them are a main character because the main character of the show isn't any of the characters that you watch. The main character of the show is the music because the music is what tells the story of everything that's happening. So the main character is actually music. So if you haven't watched it,
I love that point.
Go back and watch it because your character, your main character, which is the heart of your story, may not even be a character.
A living thing. It could just be the music score. It could be the environment. It could be, an animation of like a mountain, and like the mountain is exploding, and like you see the environment around the mountain reacting to the mountain, and therefore the mountain becomes a character, and you can see the mountain gets angry when things are happening around it, and it's constantly exploding. And so the point of the story is to get the mountain to calm down, which can lead to a theme of controlling your anger.
Right.
That's part of Fantasia. I believe that's actually part of that movie. When I was a '90s kid, I was watching that as a child, watched Fantasia, and was blown away by the fact that there was no real dialogue. It's just music score being played, and a lot of animations happening. And it's like they stitched together a bunch of shorts into one big giant volume of animation, and the music itself is the main character.
Yes. So when it comes to the character is the heart of every story, make sure that your whatever your main character is, make sure that character is illustrating where the story is going and why very well.
Exactly. Because again, the destination isn't the point. The destination is where you want to go, obviously. But how does the character get there? How do they experience that journey? Is it emotional? Is it supposed like, because not every story also has a climactic ending. Some of them have very, anticlimactic metaphorical endings where like it's either bittersweet or it's happy or it's sad. And, it's more about the metaphor and the visual metaphor than it is anything else. And so got to nail down that character and got to nail down how the character relates to the world and how the world itself becomes a character around your characters. And that will help you with mastering the ability to tell a story. Because that's something that James Gunn actually brought up recently when they were asking him about DC movies and stuff and whether or not audiences are going to deal with, superhero movie fatigue. And he said, no, it comes down to character. It comes down to what character is story are you telling, and is the audience emotionally invested in that character? Because you can have lots and lots of superhero movies, and all of them suck, but it has nothing to do with the superhero movie. It has to do with the way it was written. It has to do with whether or not the audience cares about the characters. He took the ragtag Guardians of the Galaxy, very D-list characters that nobody had ever heard of. Like, when I was reading about it and, years and years ago, I was like, wait a minute. So you're going to have a talking raccoon, a talking tree, alien guy who carries around swords. You're going to have a guy that wears a mask and he's called Star-Lord. And then another lady who somehow is tied to your bad guy named Thanos. And you're going to have them go around and try to save the galaxy? Huh? And then for me, it's like, I was like, okay, was this kind of like Star Wars? Like maybe that'll work. Or is it like something else? And then when I saw the trailer, I was like, I'm in. Because the trailer was just fantastic. And then when I watched the first movie, ironically, my favorite character ended up being the talking raccoon, the Rocket. He's like, hey, so can you get me that leg? It's like, wait, why do you want his leg so bad? Because it's funny, right? And it's like, wait, why is getting his leg so funny? It's like, because it's his leg, and you're taking his leg. Is that funny? Like, I think it's funny. And I'm just like, oh, why is Rocket my favorite right now? Especially his line in the movie, bunch of jackasses standing in a circle. Making fun of the superhero moment where they all stand up in a circle.
Right. All right, let's get on to the next one. Ties into the hero's tale, various versions of the topic at hand.
Yes. Basically, what I'm talking about there is no matter what story you're telling, whether it's the heroine's tale, whether it's the villain's tale, or whether it's the hero's tale, which all sounds the same, but it's very different from each other, as we've talked about before. Character is at the heart of all that. If you don't have the character down, then you don't have your hero story down. You don't have your villain story. You can't even humanize your villain. Because if you don't have the character down, you don't know what their heart looks like. You don't have the beyond the world power and domination or whatever the heck the motivation is going to be. You don't have the character down, and then therefore they're just a 2D image that's dancing around the screen, or a 2D image that you're reading off a text and being like, so when is the cool shit happening again? So you've got to make your hero, you got to make your heroine, you got to make your villain. I joked around with my best buddy from childhood. I joked around with him about writing a novel about a wraith, like a ghost, like telling the story of a wraith, of like what happened when they died, and then what is happening post death, and like what lesson are they supposed to learn? Because we all think that life ends when you die. It's like maybe, but like if you're spiritual as hell, then it doesn't end when you die. There's another place you go to. Well, let's go ahead and explore that. And I was joking around with my buddy about being like, what if I tell a story about a wraith? And like that wraith is trying to like communicate with the rest of the world, and they can't. And the only people that can are seers, or people that have the ability to communicate with them. And what leads them to becoming frustrated? And what if that leads to them becoming a villain? But then they're not just a villain, they're also technically a monster. Well, how do you humanize that wraith? Do you like dig into their pain? Do you dig into like what they loved as when they were alive? And how do you help them resolve their crisis of faith? How do you help them resolve their moral dilemma that they just died and they're angry and they're vengeful and something happened to them, something tragic happened to them? Where do we take them from there? And I was like thinking about that one night, and I told my buddy, and he's like, "Dude, that sounds badass as hell." And I'm like, "I know." And he's all like, "Dude, what would you do with that?" And I'm like, "There's so many things I could do with that." And he's like, I don't think there's ever, I think only ghost stories that really exist are where, the person that's telling the story is still alive. And I'm like, yeah, well, what if they're dead? And it's not a Bruce Willis thing where you find out he's dead at the end. You find out he's dead at the beginning. Well, where does he go from there? And has a tie to our dimension. And like I was thinking about that. So I'm brainstorming that right now on the side. But like those are things that I think about. Those are the things that this little crazy brain of chaos, the personal curator of chaos, thinks of when I'm telling a story.
And that was a good example. The Sixth Sense with Bruce Willis and all that. I talk to dead people, and it some people they get it about halfway through that Bruce Willis is dead. They don't get it until the end, and it's just like, some people are just like, what? So it was so well written that it took me a while to catch on, and that's a good thing, because the personality of your characters is what's going to drive it. And again, if you don't have personality with your characters, and not just your main, where we were talking, T-Paul was giving the example of the hero's tale, the villain's tale, even your secondary characters, you got to give them personality, because they are going to add to or enhance the personalities of your mains.
Yep.
Your antagonist, your protagonist, your contributors to the storyline, the people that are even in the backdrops, you have to give them some type of a personality. And because if you make the guy that's pouring the royalty, the tea, just somebody that comes up and just pours the tea without giving them a smirk or a behind the scenes thought of, I wish I could just pour this tea on his fucking face, that gives, you see his character, but you also see how much he detests the person that he's a servant to. So those secondary characters help build the strength and weaknesses of your mains.
Exactly. Yeah. If you were to delve deeper into that character, you'd probably find out that they've been doing that job for a long time. And even if they're not doing that job for a long time, maybe if they're struggling with the job, and what if they're questioning the very existence of the job? They're like going, well, why am I stuck just pouring tea for this asshole? Like, why can't I do this, or this? Like, that's something that you could go into is like, what if that character wants to be meant for more? And what if they're quite happy with the job, but they still want to do a different thing, but they're still stuck with that job? And then therefore you relate to that character because you're like, I've been there before. I've been stuck with a job I don't want. And then, and you've also had to do things for people you don't like. And so then suddenly that character becomes more real. And, they become more human as far as like their heart goes and like where they are. Because if like you broke away from the main narrative and you decided to veer off into that character story, you could end up finding out so much more about the kingdom, or just so much more about the office they work at, or the place they work at with that main character, and you could find out so much more that's behind the scenes that you're not uncovering with the other character.
Right. It's just like in the story that I'm writing, Rainbow Prophecy. I have this secondary knight that he's kind of a spy, and he doesn't have very many lines throughout the whole story. All right, but I bring in this one part where he talks about the humiliation he went through rubbing his duke's feet, which tells you how subservient he is and how angry and unjustly he's treated. You know, I mean,
Yep.
just that one aspect. I don't even have to tell a story about it because just in that one description, I have already told the story. And that adds a lot of flavor to everything else because now you know there's probably others he treats that way. How many others does he do this to? Is he just that kind of a pig? You know, I mean, it explains so much. So always remember that your secondary characters, don't leave them out of the story and only use them just to get from point C to point D. Okay. You know, give them something to make them relevant.
And also, what if that character who's being subservient, and what if he's angry about the job because he's being treated unfairly? What if there's a code of honor of ethics he wants to follow, or they want to follow? What if,
Right.
what if there was once honor in the job? It was once a super honorable position, serving your king or your master, whoever you're serving. And what if like there was a code of ethics that they all followed, and like it just started to fall apart due to bureaucracy? And suddenly you've got this political context mixed in with a moral dilemma. And what if that subservient person wants a better alpha? What if they aren't the alpha, but they want a better one? And they would really burn down the kingdom just to create a better world for the other fellow subservient nature.
Right. Right. Exactly. Okay. Now I've skipped over some things on your list and we're running a little short on time. So, do you want to go into diversity in storytelling or do you want to go into magic systems?
Um, I feel like they both tie into each other because if you're telling a diverse story with diverse characters and like you have, multiple races being talked about, that doesn't have to mean human. That doesn't have to mean, any specific species. Because I know in our current world, people love to talk about whether or not a someone of Islamic or of how do I put it? Try to put it right. But someone that has a different background, someone that has a unique background, uh, you know, a lot of times people want to see that in stories. So if you're able to tackle the heart of that, of like what that means, one of my favorite interpretations recently was Marvel's interpretation of Miss Marvel, where her family comes from a very, Middle Eastern background, and that was a diverse story. The sidekick was a white guy, and he was in love with Miss Marvel, but yet she wasn't in love with him automatically. But yet he was willing to do everything for her, and it was a diverse story. And so when you have that type of diversity, but then you have other types of diversity, like let's say your kingdom or your world is filled with elves, and like you have the dark elves, and you have the light elves, and maybe their skin color is an oxymoron, like their skin color is flipped. The dark elves have lighter skin, but they just use darker magic. And then you have the light elves, who you'll have lighter skin, or they have darker skin, and everything's flipped. And like you have like a diverse story that happens to do with different skin color, different power being used, and the complexities of the magic system tie into their race, like ties into the traditions of whatever god they worshipped, or whatever where the magic comes from. And what if their magic power is tied to their power source being their souls, or being like whatever it is? So it's kind of both. Like, depends, it could be both, but like that's kind of where I jump to. Is my brain kind of complexifies everything, but that makes it simple and stuff. But like diversity in storytelling to me is about diversifying and making your world and your characters unique and different from each other. That way, it's not all the same thing.
Right, right. Um, I think with magic systems, you have to be very careful because what I hate about some magic systems is that you can use magic to fix anything. You can use magic to do anything. And it's like, why didn't you do that in the beginning? We wouldn't have this whole problem. So you have to be careful with magic systems on how you utilize them and the kind of magics that you have. Don't use a magic system to try to save your story. You're going to fail. I The originals, which is a spin-off of the Vampire Diaries, they got to where they started just using magic for everything, and it started to disinterest me in the story because you just can't use magic to solve everything and come up with these sudden magic spells that you just didn't know about at the beginning, but now you suddenly know. No. If you're going to use a magic system, be solid with it. It can make a great story. I love magic. I mean, my God, we all went to magic shows when we were kids, or at least most of us did. Magic is wonderful, but don't destroy the magic in your story by making it do things that it couldn't do at the beginning that would have solved the problems. And
Yep.
in relation to diversity, you're telling a story. If the story is based upon our modern world, be inclusive and make it portray our modern world. That's all I need to say on that. If you're creating a world and you want to make a world where there is ideological issues between different species or races or characterizations, do so tastefully.
Yes.
I think diversity makes the world a better place, and if you're doing something that is modern, even if it's fantasy and fiction, like my story with vampires and druids, I'm not making it about the vampire and the druid. I'm making it about right and wrong. And I have a diverse scale of characters from every ethnicity, from every creed, from every country, from every sexual preference you can imagine. So even religious beliefs, keep it good, keep it clean. If race or religion or something like that is an issue in your book, present it correctly.
Yeah, balance is key. So, um, if you're gonna balance diversity in with your storytelling, especially if you're doing like modern stories, which is what you're talking about, because especially a lot of TV shows lately, like they hardly ever do anything that's not modern because they want to be able to include that diversity in there, which is cool. It's awesome. Um, balancing diversity is important because you don't want to fridge a character over the race, and you don't want to have uh story written to be like, look at me, I'm doing a diverse story. You want to basically attack the heart of it, like the humanity of it, of like, what is this character struggling with? You know, what are they dealing with? What are they doing amazing at? You know, highlight those things, highlight those elements. Keep it balanced, because if you don't balance it and you don't like figure out what they're actually dealing with, but then you run the risk of someone who actually happens to have that race, whether it's white, whether it's black, whether it's brown, whether it's whatever skin color you have. Um, you'll run the risk of being considered a token writer, someone who writes token characters, someone who writes two-dimensional drawings that, it's like, oh, they were black, but hey, look at me, I did a black story. It's like, no, you didn't. You just did a story that happened to have a black character in it. And, you run the risk of alienating a crowd because of the fact that you weren't really going into what they actually suffer and what they deal with on a daily. You weren't going into what they have to deal with by the minute, by the day. Like, because there are people that are actually getting killed over it. There are people that are actually getting, that they're being misrepresented in some way, and therefore, people that are not of their race make assumptions and stereotype things. Like, I have extended family that stereotypes people that are not white all the time, and it's annoying as hell for me. But it is what it is. And so when you're writing a story, that's kind of what, like, part of your responsibility is to tell a story in a way that hopefully is responsible. And so, like, when when I'm writing Sam's story, for instance, I'm trying to honor the fact that, like, for instance, I talked to Cornelia privately, talked to her about it, about, like, told her what my take was. I told her what, where I wanted to go with the Sam character and where I wanted to go with people that were like her. And she told me that I was dead on, how I wanted to tackle it. Because I didn't want to tackle it like a black story. Didn't want to tackle it like a mixed race story. I wanted to include mixed race in it, use it as an element, use the concept and notion that they happen to not be white as a ingredient, but I wanted to tackle what it's like to have her deal with issues of power in court when not everyone looks the same, and deal with what happens when she's undermined, what happens when she runs into conflicts, what happens when this character who wants to love and wants to have love and is dealing with people who are going insane and thirsting for power, and what happens when no matter where they turn, they're facing opposition based on what they look like and people's assumptions of them. Like that's part of the story. It's also partly sanity versus insanity in the struggle of power. So those are some of the things of how I'm balancing my own take on it. But that's why I figured I'd bring up the diversity, because everyone wants to talk about diversity and everyone wants to act like they're a hero when they talk about it. I'm no hero when I'm talking about diversity. I'm just a guy who writes a story and, is hopefully honoring a character that my wife came up with. Like, my wife created Sam and I just kind of took the reins of Sam and ran off with it. We're like, let's go play with this character. I've created other characters that are my own that are similar to her. But I wanted to talk to Cornelia and a couple of people about, their experience with that, because experience is part of it.
Well, and that's key. Okay. If you're going to write about something that you as a writer are not, make sure that you are conferring with people that are.
Yep. Sensitivity reader. It's essentially that's called, right?
Yes. And you should definitely have beta readers that have a comprehension and understanding of what you're trying to portray, because if you may think that something is a way when it's completely different. So don't think that you know more about the path that somebody else has walked. That's all I got to say on it. Confer, educate yourself, and it's greatly appreciated when you include people that otherwise have not been included in the past, because we all need a voice.
Yeah, I mean, I've run into too many like movies and TV shows and other stories where, like, because my relative watched it and because they didn't include those elements in there, they just assumed it didn't exist. They're just like, well, I've never dealt with that, so how do you know it's real? And I'm just like, oh, so there's a responsibility now with storytelling to make sure that you include those, because otherwise people will just make snap judgments anyway. And they're going to make snap judgments either way. But hopefully you as a storyteller keep that in mind when you're writing it, because if you're trying to tackle something that has something that you've never dealt with yourself, you run the risk of being tone deaf or being blind about it. And so that was something that I wanted to make sure that I kept myself in check on, because I don't want to like write that story and then be tone deaf about it.
Right, right. And trust me, I have all elements in my writing because there are all elements in the world.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. All right. Great show. Great show. Great show. We covered a lot there, my friend. We covered a lot.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Feel free, if you have ideas or you want to be a guest on the show, please contact either T. Paul or myself in our DMs on Twitter. And remember, be kind, be happy, and may good things come your way. Thank you for joining us today.